Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today we are going to go to France and talk about French neoclassicism. Now, I will let you know this particular lecture is one of the most important going forward. The reason being that French neoclassicism is going to influence the development of theater history uh, quite a bit more than, let's say, Spain, right? The Spanish Golden Age, just because of the ideas that French neoclassicism contains. And so just make sure to pay attention. Now, what is well, we know what France is, right? But what is neoclassicism? Classicism, right? Neo meaning new or renewed, right? Classicism, talking about the classical period, right? Essentially, this refers to Aristotle's Poetics. Remember how I said that during the Renaissance, a lot of ancient philosophers, ancient Greek philosophers, found new life in Europe because they had been preserved in the Arab world in the East, and then they found their way back to Europe. Now, um, remember Aristotle was talking about how his ideal plot, right? It should have kind of one plot structure, right? It should kind of teach a kind of a moral lesson, right? You should have upstanding people with tragedy who they have some kind of downfall. That the plots should be realistic. Things need to happen by um, realism or necessity, right, of the plot. Um, Now, what do the French do is they kind of take that and they do a roided up version. And I'll get to that in just a second. Now, in France, um, what did the theaters look like? They had these tennis court theaters, which get their name because of literally they turned tennis courts into theaters. Like you can imagine, right? An old indoor French tennis court where aristocrats would play tennis. Incidentally, tennis then as now is associated with upper classes and wealth as well. So you'd have these tennis courts that would already be kind of long and skinny, have bleachers on either side for the audience to watch, and they would just essentially set up a stage on one end and call it a theater. Right? This is an image of what was a tennis court, but they just decided to put a stage on one end and these important highfalutin folk sitting down in the middle. I like to think that that woman, the third figure from the right there, is looking and saying, "Why are you talking during this play?" But I think that's kind of it's funny. But you can see this kind of a large flat surface where the audience would sit, all looking toward this stage on one end. Now, Cardinal Richelieu and the French Academy. Cardinal Richelieu was again a cardinal, right? Which is a higher up in the Catholic Church, a bigwig, as it were. But he also was an advisor to King Louis XIII. He was his chief advisor. From 1624 to 1642. He was an enthusiastic supporter of the arts, France, the church, all of these sorts of things. And in his position in the government, he established the Académie Française, right, or the French Academy in 1635. Now, the French Academy, it still exists today, right? It is an organization, an institution that is meant to promote the French language, French culture, all these sorts of things, and kind of not just promote France, but also keep French culture and French language French, as it were, as opposed to outside things. It set itself up as the official authority on the French language, but it also dealt with culture, right? Cardinal Richelieu expressly had it uh, uh, give advice or rules almost for how a good play should be structured and written. And he modeled them after Aristotle, right? So the background I have from this is Spinal Tap, right? Turning them up to 11. Because when you think about Aristotle, the French Academy really roids it up. So they talk about these classical unities, these unities of time, place, and action. right? If we remember in ancient Greece, let's start with time, right? In order to have one plot, right? In order to have kind of one story being told, the action that takes place on stage can't really happen over a very long period of time, because over a long period of time would necessitate more than one story being told, right? That could link to each other, but it needs to be one story. So it really can't take place over a huge amount of time, right? That takes place of time and action. Now, remember, Aristotle thought that plays should not have subplots, right? There should be kind of one plot that you follow. And likewise, because if you have kind of a one plot, right, and it takes place, with the same people, no subplots, taking place over a relatively short period of time, it would probably take place in the same place, right? And so he thought that the unities of time, place, and action, a play should be structured with one plot taking place over a relatively short period of time in one location, right? Aristotle thought that that was the best way, or rather, he thought that that was a way that he noticed produced the most effective plays. And if you read Aristotle, it's more of he looks and sees these things out in the world and decides, aha, I see that these plays are good, and this is something that they all have in common. And this is something that they all have that is effective. Um, and he talked about decorum, right? People should act in the way that they should act in the real world, right? Certain types of, soldiers should be brave, right? Uh, Women shouldn't be, right? If we remember what Aristotle said in that sexist way. But people should behave in a proper way that people in society should, right? Verisimilitude, which is just a big word meaning realistic, right? Things, we should be able to see reality reflected back to us from what happens on stage. People should react in a realistic way. There shouldn't be anything otherwise. Right? It also must teach a moral lesson and entertain, right? Good should be punished, or sorry, good should be rewarded, bad should be punished, and it should be entertaining. Now, what the French Academy took is they took these, and instead of just using them in the same way like Aristotle did to describe what he thought was good tragedy, they took them, reversed it, and prescribed what plays should do. Right. And so the French Academy said, okay, so when in the future you are writing plays, they need to have, in order to have our stamp of approval and to be good in our eyes, right, the authority of French culture, they need to have a unity of time. And we are going to say that it has to take place within 24 hours, right? The action of a play needs to be one day or less. It has to take place in one place, and it has to be one plot, right? Okay. And not only that, decorum. If people do not act in a proper way that their roles in society, normal society, would dictate, it is not a good play. If people do not act as what we think is realistic, it is not a good play. And if bad is not punished, and if good is not rewarded, then it is not a good play, right? That is what the French Academy turned around the descriptive Aristotle and turned it into a prescriptive, right, dictum, right, for playwrights of the time to follow. And what all this meant, sometimes it's easier to look at these kind of rules and describe them and get to know what they are by what they forbid, right? So you can't have any large casts, right? The French Academy said no large casts, because if there are large casts, there will necessarily be more than one subplot. Can't have that. You can't have multiple locations, right? That violates the unity of place. You can't have violence on stage, because that would violate decorum, right? Of, this in France in this time, a lot of the plays were for the aristocracy, right? And if you're in a palace, you're not going to have people depicting murder of each other. That is just not the proper way that things are done. There's no violence on stage. People should not act in an improper way. There should be no ghosts, because that violates verisimilitude. There should be no deus ex machina, because that also violates verisimilitude. And if things happen for no reason, then what moral lesson can you learn? Like, don't be a bad person because random bad stuff might incidentally happen to you. That doesn't make sense. It has to follow from what you do. There can be no subplots, no unpunished evil, right? There can be no soliloquies because a person speaking to the audience does not happen in real life. Normally people don't, when everyone else exits a room, just start speaking to a wall about what they feel inside. And also tragic comedy, because it would blur the lines between the two, and you have to have very distinct categories of things. Now, French neoclassicism, again, it is all about these rules about what should be written. And instead of, and these are actually just criteria by which a play would be evaluated. And we'll look at the case of Le Cid in just a minute. And so they would look at a play and not just evaluate it on like, is this artistic? Does this make me feel good? Is this, is this entertaining or whatnot? They would use these as criteria, almost a rubric, right, to judge the merit of a play. So the first person we're going to talk about is Jean Racine, right? We're going to talk about a number of three of the most famous French playwrights of this time. This fellow with the great curly hair, which I'm sure is not a wig, wrote classical tragedies, right? He wrote in the Alexandrine meter of poetry, which is like iambic pentameter, in that, you have an iamb, which is bum bum, right? An unstressed and a stressed syllable. Pentameter means that there is 5 of those in a row, ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum. The Alexandrine line is just, it has another foot at the end. So it's really iambic hexameter, right? So it's ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum. Next line, ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum. Okay. And just as in English, iambic pentameter is the most common form of verse for our plays, that are written in verse to be written in. The Alexandrine line or iambic hexameter is that way for the French language. He strictly followed the unities. He wrote a play called Andromache, which is a retelling of a classical kind of myth. That's his most notable play. Now this fella, Pierre Corneille. Now he was a tragedian. He wrote tragedies. In his youth, he was supported by Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu, when he was setting up the French Academy, took 5 different authors of plays and poetry and whatnot, and decided, okay, you 5, you're going to be the core. You're going to be the ones that are going to, kind of evangelize for what we're trying to do here with the French Academy and French culture, and you're going to be my guys, right? And he called them les 5 auteurs, right? The 5 authors, very creatively named. It was created in 1634. Now, Pierre Corneille, he wrote a play called Le Cid in 1636. Now, this play did not respect these unities, right, that he was supposed to, as it were, especially decorum and verisimilitude, right? There are a couple of characters in his plays who do not seem to do what society thinks would be the right thing for them to do. And therefore, people thought that they did not act realistically, and therefore it was not a good play. It led to this thing called La Querelle du Cid, right? Which is essentially the quarrel of the Cid, right? So there was Jean Chapelain, right? He wrote Sentiments de l'Académie Française sur la Tragédie du Cid, right? Which is essentially, the feelings of the French Academy about this tragicomedy, Le Cid, right? And Jean Chapelain wrote, look, it's a terrible play because, and I'll get to that in just a second, why. And then Pierre Corneille wrote another pamphlet, these essentially open letters, right, that they distributed among high society in Paris, basically arguing with each other in public. And there were, attacks on people's characters and people's parentage, and it got very personal and heated and, somewhat trashy. But it's kind of, it's fun in that way. Now, but in order to understand the initial problem with Le Cid, you have to kind of know what the plot is. Now, Le Cid is based upon an old Spanish story, right? Also called like Le Cid. Now, Cid comes from the same root as the Arabic word Said, so it means like the Lord, right? Le Cid is the Lord. So the play centers around a relationship between two young lovers, right? Shaman, she is in love with Rodrigo. Great. So Shaman loves Rodrigo. Fantastic. However, Shaman has a father. Rodrigo also has a father, right? Shaman's father is kind of a jerk, and Rodrigo's father was promoted by the king, right? He was promoted to tutor somebody. So this is great for Rodrigo's dad, but Shaman's dad thought that he was the one who should have gotten this role. And so they have this kind of argument, right? So Shaman's dad goes to Rodrigo's dad and says, hey, I think that, I think I should have gotten this instead of you. Rodrigo's dad replies, it's fine. Like, how about we just have our kids get married and that's perfect, right? We'll just be friends. And Shaman's dad slaps him and says, no, your son is not good enough for my daughter. How dare you, right? And so because, this is a challenge to a duel, essentially, right? This slap, Rodrigo's dad tries to pick up a sword, but he can't hold it because he's so old. And this leads him to be ridiculed by Shaman's dad. Okay, so imagine that you are the character of Shaman, right? Your boyfriend's dad is fighting your dad, and your dad's a big jerk and ridicules his. That stinks. Now, Rodrigo is told by his dad to avenge his honor, right? And remember, this is a Spanish story, so this has a lot of this kind of duty, familial honor thing going on. And so Rodrigo is like, well, this is a problem, because if I'm going to avenge my father, that would mean essentially challenging my girlfriend's dad to a duel. And I don't want to kill him, because then Shaman will hate me because I killed her dad. But I'm a good person. I'm an honorable person. I know what will happen, because I have to, as Rodrigo, because I have to defend my honor, and because I need, and I need Shaman's honor to be preserved as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kill her dad, and then, because then the cycle of violence means she has to avenge her father, I will go to her and just say, like, you can kill me to save your honor because I killed your dad, right? So that's his idea. And he goes through with it, right? He kills her dad. And then he goes to Shaman and was like, look, I had to do this. I had to kill your dad because of my family honor, but because of your family honor, I'm going to offer myself to you so that you can, stab me or slice my head off or what have you. Like, here I am, do what you should do. Do what you should do for honor. Now, this is not just implied. This is actually in the text, and and this is all in Act 3. And so I'm actually going to put the relevant portions of Act 3, this dialogue that they have, because it's a number of pages where they're arguing. Rodrigo is saying, you need to kill me because it's the right and honorable thing to do, because I did the right and honorable thing. And Shaman is like, but I love you, and so I can't. I know I should, but I can't. Aha. And so Shaman saying, I know I should, but I can't because I love you, that particular thing is what the French Academy had a big problem with, because they thought, well, she's doing something that is, dishonorable, right? It is not something that a woman should do, is to say, well, you know what? My boyfriend is more important than my family honor. They should not say that, but she is. And therefore, at the end of the play, because this was thought to be something negative that she did, the people, the French Academy reading this and the people watching it would expect Shaman to be punished, but she really isn't, right? And so they end the play with Shaman doing something that, in the literal words of the play, she knows is the right thing to, she doesn't do the thing that she knows is the right thing to do, and instead follows her heart, which is not the right thing to do. And she's not punished for it. And this causes this big, huge uproar. Either she is not acting realistically, or she's not acting with decorum. She cannot be acting realistically and with decorum, because a realistic person would not act that way in, you know, based upon what society says. So that is the level of the minute kind of plot and character choices that brings about this whole big hullabaloo. And that is the level that the French Academy cared about plot, and about the Frenchness and properness of the plays coming out. So now we're going to get to this fella, switching gears a little. This um, dashing fop here. Molière, also Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, from 1622 to 1673. He is the most famous French playwright ever. He is, you know, he is to France what Shakespeare is to England. Right? He wrote in verse. He wrote a whole bunch of very, very funny plays. And when you read Tartuffe, you will understand why. This is the gentleman whose play we are reading right now, Tartuffe. He wrote comedy, very funny. His troupe was called the King's Troupe because they had patronage from the king. His satires provoked the ire of the church, especially this play that we're reading, and you will understand why, because Tartuffe is, he fashions himself kind of a priest, essentially. Molière collapsed during a run of a play called The Imaginary Invalid, which is a play about someone who has, you know, who pretends like they're sick all the time to get sympathy. A hypochondriac, essentially. That's another translation of the title of The Imaginary Invalid, is the hypochondriac. But his character was wearing green, and he collapsed during a performance. And then, you know, he got back up, dusted himself off, and he died just the same day, which is why in some circles it is bad luck to wear green on stage, because of this fellow Molière. So he played a character who was pretend dying, only to literally die afterward. And he was also not allowed to be buried in consecrated ground, because there was still some of that baggage and hangups about actors being, you know, immoral, and essentially kind of like, you know, we'll watch them perform, but we don't want to associate with people like that. French law prohibited actors from being buried in consecrated ground. So essentially what happened is, after he was buried in, you know, not on a church ground, being just like regular dirt, his friends actually dug him back up and snuck him into a real consecrated cemetery and put him in there. So yeah, friends like that help bury you in the right place. So that's Molière. Great. Now, I again want you to remember a whole bunch of things about the unities of time, place, and action, because even more so than what Aristotle thought about what makes a good plot, the French Academy's ideas and their interpretations and furtherances of what Aristotle thought, that will become kind of the type of theater that people are going to be reacting against. And so in order to understand, when we get to them, people like Beckett and Brecht and Artaud, we have to know what they are reacting against. And this sort of strict moral realism is what they are mostly reacting against. But thank you all very much. Yeah, study for your midterm. Cool. Awesome.